Dear participants, hello and welcome to this second session of our series of webinars. Welcome to this first webinar on the drafting of test guidelines. Would like to make a few housekeeping announcements before we start. Please be informed that the webinar will be of a duration of 90 minutes at a maximum. And we would like to ask you all to rename yourselves by displaying the 2-letter country code before your name. If you are participating from an observer organization, please display the acronym of the organization. There will not be any interpretation during this webinar, and we would kindly ask you to keep all of your microphones on mute. There will be 2 parts to this webinar. The first part will be presentations. We will receive 2 presentations. And the second part will be a questions and answers session. At the Q&A session, please raise your electronic hand in Zoom to request the floor. Once you are invited to unmute, please unmute yourself and activate your video so that you can ask your question. We will also be monitoring the chat function, so don't hesitate to ask your questions in the chat if you would prefer. Lastly, the meeting is being recorded and will be made available on the UPOV website and on our YouTube channel. The question and answer session will not be recorded, only the presentations. So only part 1 will be made available after this webinar. So we will now start with our first presentation, which will be from our colleague from the UPOV office, Ms. Romy Oertel, on the introduction to drafting UPOV Test Guidelines. So I would like to ask Romy to make her presentation now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessica. And thank you to everyone for joining, and welcome to this webinar on drafting test guidelines. So this presentation is supposed to give you a general overview over the drafting process of test guidelines, and also to address items and questions that regularly come up during the drafting process and at the technical working parties. With regard to drafting test guidelines, UPOV provides an extensive amount of guidance, as you can see here on screen. We do have guidance on the US growing trial itself, but also guidance around the growing trial, going beyond the growing trial. For example, on variety collections, on experience and cooperation in the US testing, guidance for new types and species. And these documents, the first one on top is an important one, the general introduction to the US examinations. And all the other ones, we call them TGP documents, as they're related to test guidelines. And you can find them all on the UPOV website. They're part of the UPOV collection. And during this presentation today, I will be focusing on document TGP 7, Development on Test Guidelines. And to start with, I would like to explain the difference between the TG template and web-based TG template, 2 terms that we regularly use in UPOV, and that maybe for participants that are new to the test guidelines word might be confusing. So as just mentioned, we have document TGP 7, which provides guidance on how to draft your test guidelines and also wordings that help you to put your test guidelines together. This is called the TG template. And then we also have the web-based TG template. This is actually the tool that we are using to draft test guidelines that is used by leading experts and interested experts similarly. Next, I would like to give you an overview of the drafting process. So first of all, the technical working parties at their meetings discuss what they could put on the agenda for their meeting in the following year and agree on the test guidelines to be discussed. This is the usual way, but occasionally it can happen that we receive proposals later. That's possible until the TC meeting in October, TC being the technical committee. And subject to agreement by the TC, these new proposals would then also be added. As soon as the working parties decide that test guidelines should be added to the agenda, they also define leading experts and a subgroup of interested experts. And those together create the drafts to be discussed at the technical working parties. So there is a first draft that is discussed, comments are made on what needs to be changed, and then subsequently a new draft is prepared for year number 2. And this goes on for a varying number of years, depending on the complexity of the crop. So the shortest period probably is about 2 years for full draft test guidelines, and it can go up for a few more years. At some point, the TWP will decide that now we have a good and solid draft, no more questions pending, all information provided, and we can submit the draft for adoption. So at this point, the next stage is that the draft will be considered by the enlarged editorial committee, TC-EDC, and then submitted for adoption to the technical committee. And when we say the TWPs agree on test guidelines, there are 3 different options. We have new test guidelines. This means they are prepared from scratch. And because before those are added to the agenda and agreed to be drafted, we look into the number of applications and also the number of authorities having practical experience. Currently, UPOV has 339 adopted test guidelines covering 94% of all applications. So that's a very big part. And now we have to make sure that there is enough experience amongst members to draft the new test guidelines. Because as we know, test guidelines are all about harmonization. So there needs to be enough information and experience and data to actually draft a meaningful test guidelines, useful for harmonization. And if that's not yet the case, we recommend to work with national test guidelines, but of course the proposal can always be reconsidered, and maybe a couple of years later the situation has changed. Then we also have full revisions. That means the revision of an existing previously adopted test guidelines. The whole document is being revised, all parts of it, the characteristics, yeah, literally everything. And it's also updated to the latest version of the TG template in TGP 7. Finally, we have partial revisions. And a partial revision means that there's a very specific and clearly defined part of the test guidelines revised. In most cases, that refers to characteristics, even either changing characteristics or also adding new characteristics. And a recurring example that we have are, for example, disease resistances, which are revised regularly in order to reflect fast breeding developments. Now, I've already mentioned the leading experts and the interested experts. So the leading expert is the person responsible for the preparation of the draft. And the interested experts are experts that are helping the leading expert by sharing their knowledge and experience and sharing information with the leading expert. And they also provide comments that has been prepared on the draft that has been prepared by the leading expert. Now, how does that work? Also in TGP 7, we have guidance on this, on the deadlines of the procedure of drafting test guidelines. So for every TWP draft, the leading expert creates a preliminary draft, which is considered by the subgroup of interested experts. The interested experts have 4 weeks to check and comment on the draft. This is followed by another 4-week period for the leading expert to check the comments and to adjust his draft as applicable. After this period, the draft will be submitted to the office, and the office ultimately publishes it 4 weeks before the technical working party on the UPOV website for everyone to check the draft before the discussion. Now, getting to the technical working parties, there we have the subgroup discussions, and they consist of the leading expert and the interested experts, but we do try to have plenary discussions at the technical working parties to have a bigger number of experts there who can also help sharing their general knowledge, their knowledge on UPOV guidance to improve the draft. And one last point on this, sorry. We do also encourage additional exchanges and meetings between leading experts and interested experts to this drafting procedure that I've just pointed out, because during the technical working parties, discussion time for draft test guidelines is 90 minutes. And that can be little time to discuss full draft test guidelines. And so in order to advance the development of the draft and to finish it rather quickly after a low number of years, it's really encouraged that the leading and interested experts work together throughout the year and not just during the TGP7 drafting period. Now, we come to the point when the TWP agrees that the draft is ready to go for adoption. It's a final TWP draft. And I've added here on my slide a little asterisk. And this is to say that all possible final draft test guidelines receive an asterisk in the previous year's TWP report, so that everyone, the interested experts, the office as well, knows that the next draft might be the last draft before it's submitted for adoption, and that extra consideration and checking should be given to this draft. And then a final TWP draft is actually when the draft is complete, there is no information missing, and the whole working party agrees that it's now a very good draft and it's ready to go for adoption. Prior to adoption, the draft will be considered, all draft test guidelines will be considered by the enlarged editorial committee. And that's a very small body consisting of the TWP chairpersons and linguistic experts for the 4 languages, the 4 official UPOV languages, English, French, German, and Spanish. And the purpose of the TCEDC is to check the draft test guidelines for consistency and coherence with UPOV guidance, and also to perform linguistic checking. And as the TCEDC is such a small body, it often feels like it's happening kind of behind the curtains. So I'd actually would like to go a little bit more into detail here so that you all know a little bit about what's happening at the TCEDC. And before I do that, just another reminder for experts that the drafts to be considered by the TCEDC and also for adoption are prepared by the office. So unlike the TWP drafts, the leading expert doesn't have to take action. We are going to do that, the UPOV office, and of course send these drafts for approval to the leading experts before we publish them on the UPOV website. So back to the TCEDC. There are 3 potential outcomes of the TCEDC. So the TWP sends the test guidelines for adoption, it goes to the EDC. If the EDC agrees that there are no changes necessary or purely editorial changes that are easily to be agreed upon by the EDC, it can go for adoption straight away. If the TCEDC finds items for which editorial clarifications are necessary, those clarifications will be requested from the leading expert. The test guidelines will then be reconsidered by the TC-EDC at its next meeting. And if then everything is clear, the test guidelines can go for adoption. The third scenario is that the TC-EDC finds technical issues in the test guidelines. And in this case, the draft test guidelines are referred back to the TWP in order to clarify these issues. And then at the next TC-EDC meeting, the test guidelines will be reconsidered by the EDC. And then if everything is resolved, goes for adoption by the TC. Now, with regard to adoption, there are two possibilities. It's either at the TC session, which usually is held in October, or by correspondence in March. The TC-EDC usually holds meetings before the TC session, early October, and all test guidelines that are cleared for adoption can be adopted straight away in October. And then the EDC holds more meetings in January and March, and all test guidelines cleared for adoption will then be circulated for adoption by correspondence. And in this case, there is a 6-week objection period. And if no objections have been received to the test guidelines circulated, then the test guidelines are adopted. And another important information with regard to the EDC, all changes agreed by the TC-EDC will go to the TC report. So everyone has the chance to follow what was changed and what has been agreed. And also in the case of adoption by correspondence, these changes are included in the circular so that everyone, it's fully transparent and everything can know which changes were made to the test guidelines. Now that we've covered the drafting process, we can actually look closer into the test guidelines. So here on screen, you have the cover page of the latest adopted test guidelines, TG 341, which is Mulberry. And you can see here that on the cover page, we point out, or we can see the coverage of the test guidelines. And that's also what I would like to start with. When the TWP agree that the test guidelines should be discussed, they also agree on the genus or one or more species covered by the TG. Now, the office checks the corresponding UPOV codes and also the names for coherence with Gini and Grin to make sure that they are correct in the test guidelines. And that's also why they are added by the office to the web-based TG template. So the coverage is one of the very few, if not the only item that is added to the drafts in the web-based TG template. So if any experts require changes to the coverage, to the botanical names, please contact the office and we will take care of that. So every test guidelines, stepping right into them now, has 10 chapters. And all those chapters are based also on document TGP7 and the TG template presented there. The first chapters 1 to 6, mainly give general guidance on the trial setup, on the growing cycles, how to observe distinctness, uniformity, stability. So that's more of the general part. And then we do have, in order to build the test guidelines, TGP7 also gives us help and provides wording for these chapters. Here again, we have different options. First, we have the standard wording. This is wording which is included unchanged in all test guidelines. You can see here an example of chapter 2. And the little blue highlight here means that this is a part, for example, where the leading expert has to add information to this standard wording. The material is to be supplied in the form of, for example, plants, whatever is applicable. So that's the standard wording. Next, we have the additional standard wording, and those are standardized options to be selected by the leading expert as appropriate for the crop. So here's an example. We have the number of growing cycles, whether there's 1 or 2 growing cycles applicable for the relevant crop. Also presented in TGP7 are guidance notes, and those are guidance for specific sections of the test guidelines. They explain what needs to be presented, which information needs to be presented in the relevant chapter. And I also include links to other TGP documents, where it's good to check a different TGP document to have the full set of information necessary. Here on screen, I put an example of GN0, and TGP7 in total provides 37 guidance notes. One of the key parts of the test guidelines is Chapter 7, the table of characteristics. And here there are all characteristics listed that should be observed in the growing trial. And as you can see here, there's a lot of information contained in each and every single characteristic. We have an asterisk, we have QN, we have notes, we have all this information there. And again, back to TGP7, we have guidance notes 12 to 21, which give information in detail on the selection of characteristics, the relationship between asterisk, grouping, and TQ characteristics, how to present characteristics, their order, types of expression, method of observation, and also example varieties. I'm not going to go into any detail here because there is a separate presentation on drafting characteristics. But what I would like to add, that for drafting characteristics, you can largely benefit from the database of approved characteristics that is included in the web-based TG template. And it actually contains all characteristics of test guidelines adopted since the adoption of document TGP7. So this means that the wording is already approved and is correct and can easily be reused. So as you can see here on screen, we have a search functionality where you can simply look for your characteristic name or a keyword. The results will come up based on your research. And then you can reuse this characteristic, import it as your own characteristic, and then complete it as applicable, and also, of course, change it as applicable. But it gives you good inspiration and helps you to get the right wording immediately when you're first drafting your characteristic. And I did say I don't want to go too much into detail, but there's one item that I would like to mention a bit more in detail, and that's the example varieties, because there we regularly have discussions at the TWPs. So when do we actually need example varieties in a characteristic? When they are important for international harmonization, that means asterisk characteristics. When they're influenced by the environment, that's QN and PQ characteristics. And also when they are necessary to illustrate the characteristic. Now, what is important, that in the guidance in TGP7, it mentions that the goal is to minimize the number of example varieties used throughout the test guidelines. So that means to have a small number of test guidelines used in the table of characteristics, but to use it in as many characteristics as possible. So low number in total and reuse them in as many characteristics as possible. It's also important that the set of example varieties is developed by one expert in order to make sure that all the example varieties represent the same scale. If necessary, we can have multiple sets of example varieties in test guidelines. For example, if there is a separate scale or different types of varieties, etc. So key point is developed by one expert, and in case of doubt or if applicable, we can have multiple sets of example varieties. Next, I'm jumping quickly to a different TGP document, which is number 14, Glossary of Terms Used in UPOV Documents. So this includes definition of terms used in test guidelines, how to present shapes, plan structures, and also how to present color characteristics. There will be a separate presentation on this, on document TGP 14 as well. So I leave it at that in this presentation. Next, we are going to chapter 8, which contains all the explanations in test guidelines, explanations on characteristics. And there are different types again. We have explanations covering all characteristics. We have explanations covering several characteristics. And you can see in the example here, explanations covering all characteristics are showing up right on top of chapter 8, followed by the explanations covering several characteristics, which are indicated with small letters and brackets. And those apply usually to a group of characteristics. Let's say, for example, plant characteristics, leaf characteristics, flower characteristics. And so then these labels are also added to the relevant characteristics in the table of characteristics. Then we also have explanation for individual characteristics. Those are indicated with a plus for each characteristic that has one. And we have a separate subsection in chapter 8 for additional explanations, which can be, for example, growth stages. Now, when we're talking about explanations, we also talk about illustrations in test guidelines. And here I'd like to add some guidance as well on when you're using photographs. It's important to make sure that they have a good resolution, that in the case of several illustrations for one characteristic, to make sure that they have the same size and the same background. A white light background is always preferred, and that all the photos are taken from the same perspective to make sure that really it's clear what is to be observed and a clear representation of what should be seen. In the case of absence of photographs, you can also use drawings. TGP 14 for this is a great basis. There are sample illustrations for shapes, for margins, for example. So check TGP 14 if you need simple illustrations. And of course, you're also free to use your creativity or the creativity of your TWP participants or your colleagues, so you can come up with your drawings yourself as well. And another reminder on illustrations, please do not use color illustrations in test guidelines, and this simply for the reason that they can look different depending on the printer or the screen, and it's just not reliable as it's not guaranteed that everyone sees the same thing. So it has been agreed that color should not be illustrated in test guidelines. And lastly, with regard to illustrations, please make sure that you have the permission in case you use third-party illustrations from third parties. And that you have the permission to use those. There's more information on that in guidance note 0 if you want to look back at it, but that's very important. And now for the last part of this presentation, I'd like to go into the web-based TG template, the drafting tool that we are using. For those of you who are not familiar with it, right after login, there is a link to a tutorial available for all experts using the template. And we do have leading experts who use the template completing their drafts, and also the interested experts are using it. They are seeing the same screens as the leading expert, as completed by the leading expert, and they have the option to make comments on individual sections, characteristics, or explanations. Of course, they can also export a Word version to check before they want to make their comments. And an important functionality in the TG template is that it helps us stick to the deadlines according to TGP7, as pointed out before. All the deadlines are set in the system, and we also do have automatic reminders in the system, which means that whenever a period of action starts, either for a leading expert or an interested expert, an automatic reminder will be sent, and also 1 week before the end of action periods. Sorry. And another advantage of the TG template is that if all experts are working together, using the tool and making their comments, via the dashboard, you can access the list of all comments made by all experts. And the leading expert also has the option to reply to those comments on whether he accepted the comment and made the change or he does not agree. So the TG template really helps to bring everyone together and everyone to have access to the same information. Now we are planning a new deployment at the end of this month of the web-based TG template, where we will change the login technology. We will change to WIPO accounts. We will improve the speed of the system as we will move it to the cloud, and as it will be cloud-based, it will be faster. We will have new rich text editors for easier upload of illustrations and their editing. We will have a new export as well, which will look much nicer than the current one. No more tables within tables. And we also have fixed some bugs. And I can also mention that we are planning a fully revamped version of the web-based TG template with an update to new technologies and also the addition of new functionalities. Further information on that will be provided in due course. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention and finish my presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Romy. To the participants, please keep your questions for Romy for part 2, the questions and answers session. I would like to now give the floor to Hilary Papworth, who will make a presentation on drafting national test guidelines in the absence of UPOV test guidelines. Hilary, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Good afternoon, everybody. I will just share my presentation with you. Right, well, thank you for your time this afternoon, everyone. My name is Hilary Papworth and I work at NIAB in Cambridge, which is one of the UK's testing organisation. And my specialisation is in ornamental crops. I'm also the UK representative at the TWO and I'm the current chair of that group. Today, I'm going to be presenting on how to develop DUS testing when no UK test guideline is present, no UPOV test guideline is present. And this is from a United Kingdom perspective. Firstly, the background to the UK system. We take UPOV TGs and develop these into national DUS protocols. These contain information such as the table of characteristics and uniformity standards, but they also contain details which are specific to the UK testing programme. The implementation of these is overseen by 2 governance groups. These are the National List and Seeds Committee and the Plant Varieties and Seeds Committee. These groups are responsible for the decisions on listing and the grant of PBR, and they agree the protocols under which this is done. These protocols have to be reviewed and any changes have to be agreed by these governance groups. Not all UK crops have a corresponding UPOV TG. In these cases, we will develop our own guidance, and in the main, this is for ornamental species. All of the protocols we develop are according to UPOV principles, and use the information provided in the UPOV TGP documents. In particular, TGP7, Development of Test Guidelines, TGP8, Trial Design and Techniques, TGP10, Examining Uniformity, and TGP14, the Glossary of Terms. During this presentation, I'll refer back to these documents, but I can't cover them in any great detail. As Romy said, there will be presentations on some of these aspects tomorrow, but I encourage any of you that are looking to develop your own DUS guidelines to use the information provided by UPOV. In our experience, new guidance might be needed for a completely different genus or species, or for a different method of propagation within a known species. Our first step will be to check the UPOV Genie database to see if other authorities have experience. If there's not, we would develop our own in line with UPOV principles. Chapter 9 in the general introduction recommends that we develop guidance in the same way as we would if we were developing a new UPOV TG. The general introduction further describes the process. We are encouraged to align with UPOV principles in the general introduction and in TGP7, which covers the development of test guidelines. We should document our guidance only to the extent that current experience and the information available permits us. We should not try and go further than current knowledge. Members are then requested to inform UPOV that this guidance has been developed. This is in accordance with the process in TGP5, experience and cooperation in DUS testing. This allows other members of the union to be aware of it, and the relevant working parties can consider if harmonisation is necessary. In addition, TGP7, section 4.3, directs those of us that are drafting test guidelines to the resources that UPOV makes available, including all of the adopted UPOV TGs. So looking at the guidance in more detail, what are the areas we need to cover? So we need to think about what is going to be covered by the test guideline. So that's the scope. So which species or genus are going to be covered by the test guideline, and what methods of propagation are appropriate to those test guidelines, those species. We need to think about the design of the trial, the number of growing cycles, the number of plants to be examined, what methods of observation will be used, how the trial will be laid out. And we also need to think about the table of characteristics. This is a vital part of the test guideline. It is the definition of the variety, and it is the basis for the examination of distinctness, uniformity, and stability. I'll go through each of these areas in more detail, and my aim is to direct you to the aspects of the UPOV guidance which is most relevant for those different parts. The general introduction informs us that in most cases, individual test guidelines are prepared for each species, although in some cases it may be appropriate to prepare test guidelines covering a wider or narrower grouping of varieties. This may mean that the guideline is developed for a single species, a group of species, or a whole genus. It may even mean that different types within a species or genus have different guidance. This can only be decided by investigation into the species and genera to see how to approach the coverage. This may also highlight problems with the taxonomy or with the attribution of the species in the application. Situations do arise where a new species is not really new. It's just a different taxonomic approach. These investigations will also help to identify if there are any related species that can be adapted to your needs. So there may be a TG where we can take parts of the existing information, such as the table of characteristics. Understanding what exists as varieties of common knowledge is an important stage. This not only gives us our variety collection and helps identify what we need to grow in the trial for side-by-side comparison, but it also helps us to understand what variation exists between the varieties and what is the expected variation within a variety. This informs us of many aspects of what is appropriate for the trial design. The general introduction provides us with guidance on what is understood as a variety of common knowledge. It is necessary to understand the method of propagation of a variety to be tested. This is the method of reproduction of the variety and not the method by which the variety was bred. The method of propagation will inform us how we should approach the trial design and how we should assess uniformity. It is therefore vital that the applicant provides this information in the TQ and that the background investigation provides adequate details of what is known. It is possible that guidance will need to be developed for more than one type of propagation, but as mentioned earlier, we should not exceed the range of what is currently known. Part of the guidance relates to the minimum number of growing cycles that are needed. The definition of a growing cycle does vary on the type of plant. However, for the purpose of this discussion, we can consider that it is a period of time in which all of the characteristics can be observed. So, for example, from seed for sowing through growth, flowering, seed set, and to harvest. Or from a dormant tree through bud burst, flowering, fruit set, and harvest back to dormancy. Our aim is that the period of test is sufficient to accurately describe and establish if a variety is DU&S. Where a trial may need time to establish before plants fully express their characteristics, this period can be considered as excluded from the number of growing cycles. So when deciding on the number of growing cycles, we should consider how much the expression of characteristic changes due to the environment, so that we have captured a good description of the variety. Linked to this is also the consistency of the differences we've seen between varieties. More than 1 year may be needed to make sure what we have observed remains the same. Variation within varieties will also influence the number of growing cycles. More data from multiple years may be needed to establish if the variation is anticipated to be high. Similarly, the number of plants examined needs to take into account how much variation is anticipated. In general, the more variation, the greater the number of plants to be examined. We also need to think about how D and U will be assessed, what type of data will be collected, and what form that will be. For example, sufficient plants need to be available if plants or parts of plants need to be removed from the trial for destructive assessment. While it is important for the trial design to be robust and fulfill UPOV principles, as authorities and test organisations, we also have to make sure that the trial can feasibly be delivered, and we should also consider affordability and minimise the size of the trial. It doesn't need to be all-encompassing. When making observations in the trial, this can be done by different methods and by collecting different types of record. These should be determined by the method of propagation of the variety and the type of characteristic. TGP 9 provides the following guidance. Characteristics can be either measured, that is against a calibrated linear scale such as a ruler or scales, these are referred to as M, or they can be visually observed, where they are determined against reference sources such as example varieties, diagrams, and colour charts. These are referred to as V. The type of record can either be a single record for a variety, a group of plants, or parts of plants. These are referred to as G. Or there can be a number of records on single plants or parts of plants, which result in multiple pieces of data for one variety. These are referred to as S. The table provided at 4.5 of TGP9 summarizes the common methods of observation and types of record used. So if we look at the method of propagation in the first column and see vegetatively propagated, and the type of characteristic QL, the table indicates VG. So visual assessment resulting in a single record for the variety. But if we look across the table to the QN characteristics for the same method of propagation, there are more potential methods listed. There are different possibilities for the trial layout and the plot design. For example, either single plots or replicated plots. These will be determined by the approaches used for the assessment of distinctness, uniformity, and stability. Document TGP8 provides this table summarizing the common types of trial design. So referring back to our VG method of observation, we can see that the trial design would consist of single plots. There is also the possibility that different types of trial might be needed to observe different characteristics for the same variety. In order to establish if a variety is sufficiently uniform, we need to know what standard we are comparing the variety against. These will not be the same for all guidelines. The UPOV convention and guidance makes it clear that we should be assessing uniformity of a variety subject to the variation that may be expected from it, the particular features of its propagation. The text I've put on the slide further expands on this point, saying that the levels of uniformity required will generally be different in varieties of different propagation methods. For example, the uniformity expected of a variety that is vegetatively propagated would not generally be the same as one that is cross-pollinated. When developing guidance on uniformity in new species, we should consult TGP10 to determine the approach and the standards. Moving on to the table of characteristics. It is important to consider what needs to be included and what it is appropriate to include. The list of characteristics in the guideline has two purposes. One, to define the variety, and two, to assess if the variety is DUNS. The characteristics used should fulfill the criteria set out in 4.2.1 of the general introduction. That is, they should result from a given genotype or combination of genotypes. They should be sufficiently consistent and repeatable in a given environment. They should express sufficient variation between varieties to be able to establish distinctness. They should be capable of precise definition and recognition, and they should allow the requirements of uniformity and stability to be fulfilled. However, it is not expected that the table of characteristics be an exhaustive list of all of the plant's botanical features, and we should not consider that the list is permanently fixed. It should be subject to periodic review to cope with new types and trends in breeding. Published on the UPOV website, as Romy has already mentioned, there are 341 internationally harmonized test guidelines. These have undergone the scrutiny of the relevant working party and the technical committee, and this makes them an obvious place to start with the development of a national guideline. But we should also look to TGP7 and TGP14 for guidance on our particular types. So I'm next going to work through some practical examples of where we have developed guidance on new species. So we developed testing for the species Alonsoa meriondalis. This species was an ornamental plant, and it could be either vegetatively propagated or seed propagated from the investigations that we carried out. It sits within the family Scrophulariaceae, and other plants of this family that we were familiar with included Nemesia and Diacia, and both of these had UPOV Test Guidelines, which was a good place for us to start. We carried out a scoping of the varieties of common knowledge. We started using with the Pluto database, commercial registers, company catalogues, websites, literature. And we identified a list of similar varieties, including some of the ones that you can see on the slide. We found that foliage colour and flower colour were useful grouping characteristics, and as it turns out, our varieties were the only ones that we identified with variegated foliage, but for our ability to validate the protocol that we had created, we included a greater range of varieties in the trial for comparison purposes. So the trial design for this species, our applications were vegetatively propagated. So our trial design resulted in a small sample size, so only a minimum of 8 plants were required. It took place over a single growing cycle. There was no plot replication either. The population standard was 1% with an acceptance probability of at least 95%, which in our sample size meant that one off-type was allowed. Characteristics were observed were visual observations, and they were based on groups of plants, and assessment of uniformity was by visual off-types. We grew the trial outside in containers, as this matched the production method for the crop and its end use by consumers. This also matched the other trials that were growing of this type, so it made the management of the trial simple. So when developing the table of characteristics, we found that Alonsoa was very similar in appearance to Diacia. So we took TG233/1 and used this as a basis for the list of characteristics. Our protocol resulted in a list of 24 characteristics, and this was compared with 31 in the Diacia TG. We kept the characteristic leaf variegation as an example, because this was very important for our new candidate varieties, because they were variegated as well. But there were botanical differences between Alonsoa and Diacia, and Diacias have a floral structure of flower spurs, which are not present in Alonsoa, so these were removed from the characteristic list. An example of where we already had existing guidance, but we needed to develop it further, was in Saxifraga. We've said before that we do not develop guidance where we do not have a need or knowledge to properly develop the method. In this case, a different method of propagation became relevant, and we had to carry out some investigations to find out what was appropriate in terms of the uniformity standards and for the methods of observation. Within the United Kingdom, we're very lucky. We are able to consult with a group of expert statisticians. So when I am confronted with having to change my methodology, I can consult with them. So this is the example of Saxifraga. Up until this point, we had tested vegetatively propagated species, applications of this species, but we received an application for a cross-pollinated seed-raised variety. We decided that the most appropriate approach to this was to establish uniformity by relative standards and by using visual off-types. And we needed to change some of our methods of observation on the QN characteristics to gather enough information to be able to do the comparison by relative standards. And it was decided that these would be on plant height of foliage, leaf width, flower and flower stem length. These were all done that way. So drawing my talk to a conclusion, I would say my take-home messages from this are Use the guidance that UPOV provides in the TGP documents. They're an invaluable resource. Do your background investigations into the new type, including looking at its taxonomy and its features of its propagation. Use a comparable species as the basis for the TG. It can save a lot of work for you if you can find something related that you can work with. You must make the TG relevant to the method of propagation. It's a fundamental fact in the development of guidelines that our assessment of D and U and our design of our trial must be relevant to the method of propagation. We need to make sure that the trial design is feasible and relevant. We have to be able to deliver this in a cost-effective way. And any guidance that we develop, we should try and validate against existing varieties of common knowledge and be prepared to change it if we find that there are things that do not work or are not relevant within it. It can be useful to peer review your documents, and particularly if you have governance bodies within your country. This can be an important stage in the process, and there are always members of the UPOV International Group that can help if you're inexperienced with drafting of test guidelines. And always be prepared to further develop your guidance, either when new methods of propagation become relevant or when breeding methods change and new traits are introduced. So thank you everyone for your time this afternoon. I hope that was useful for you.